Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And today I wanted to share a few thoughts on sprite design, primarily the idea of character proportion and rendering style. When we're making a new character sprite, it's amazing how many stylistic directions are available to us, even within a relatively restricted space. To show you what I mean, I've compiled a lineup of Mega Men, because it's interesting to compare the various incarnations of this character throughout his history. And of course, X is a different character altogether, however, his design shares enough similarity with the original Mega Man that it's still instructive for these comparison purposes. First of all, let's talk about character proportions in general. Now, the rough guide to follow is that if you're attempting to make an accurate and well-proportioned human, their overall height should be equivalent to about 7 heads tall, or thereabouts. For characters that have more cartoony proportions, as is often the case with video game characters, this height structure can drop to somewhere around 3 or 4 heads tall. And in more extreme cases, or super deformed proportions, characters could even be only 2 heads tall, with half their overall height being just the head. With pixel art, this is very easy to keep track of actually because we're literally working within a grid, so you could count out the pixels of the head and the height and keep these proportions in check. In the case of the Mega Man lineup, we see ratios around 2 to 3 heads tall, with the NES and Game Boy sprites having the most deformed proportions, all the way up to the X4 sprite having the most, normal? Or closest to normal from this set anyway. The Mega Man X character is supposed to be a more mature interpretation of this character idea anyway, so it makes sense to push his proportions towards that end of the spectrum. When planning out a new sprite design, it can be useful to drop down the character proportions first by using simple shapes, such as circles for the head and hands, and blocks for the feet. This way you can play around with the sprite height and the head sizes to plan out those proportions. The added benefit of allocating more space to the head of the character is that it ensures a nice read of their face and expressions, even when viewing it from a distance like in the context of a game. Similarly, enlarged hands and feet also help reinforce this readability and also generate a balanced character silhouette that feels grounded. Alright, let's move on to sprite rendering, as in the actual art style used in the design. In these examples, there's of course an element of hardware restriction that comes into play, such as the NES and Game Boy using these 24 pixel tall sprites and respective limited color palettes. But you'll see that even within these restrictions, they were able to evolve and stylize the character for the Mega Man Extreme series on the Game Boy Color, where some careful line work creates a more complex and detailed appearance compared to that original sprite. While we're here, I was just curious what the Extreme sprite would look like with more colors, so I've made this quick edit just to see. I think the simplicity from the restricted color palette of the original has a nice charm to it, of course, but the combination of a small sprite design with a wider color palette is something interesting to explore as well. Moving into the Super Nintendo and PlayStation era, we've got different appearances and sprite sizes ranging from 34 to 45 pixels in height. Combined with a higher available color count, the higher pixel density available in this magnitude of sprite height allows for more effective customizability and style, such as the simple shading and cartoony appearance of the Mega Man 7 sprite, over to the highly shaded and almost three-dimensional quality of the X4 sprite. This difference in rendering is more obvious if we take a closer look at the shading on the boots. While the Mega Man 7 sprite uses a solid outline with 3 different levels of fill colors, the X4 sprite doesn't really use an outline at all, and instead creates a gradient look by using a greater number of colors with a more gradual shift to achieve the shading here. And it even includes some lighter grays to use for this bit of specular shine on the boots. Attempting this style of rendering can be tricky, because if you apply it too evenly and symmetrically, it creates a banding effect that can be visually unappealing. So it's important to think about the light source and have the shading wrap according to the expected form of the object, such as having broader solid sections that are away from the light, like in this example. Another interesting example of style is the Mega Man sprite from Marvel vs. Capcom. At a height of around 70 pixels, it provides enough resolution to maintain the hand-illustrated comic-style nature of the character art. Most of the rendering here is comprised of an outline, a fill color, and a singular shade tone for each costume element. On top of that, there are a few in-between tones that smooth together those shadows and line work. Also, the back leg and arms shift every tone down by 1 so that they're slightly darker, which creates some depth and helps indicate which side is closer to the viewer. This same idea is used on a few of the other sprites, where highlights are applied stronger on the leg that's closest to the viewer, and a weaker use of highlights on the back leg. On the topic of rendering, the placement of singular pixels can become very important. Looking closely at the head of the Mega Man 8 sprite, we can see that the outline portion uses a variety of skin tones to create shaping along the face. The lighter pixels help indicate areas of prominence, like the nose, or where light is hitting the face, and this essentially directs the visual flow of the facial structure. They've even used select individual pixels around the eye to shape the expression. But I've always felt that the personality in this sprite was a little lacking, and that he almost looks a bit blank or emotionless, at least when compared to the quirky confidence of the Mega Man 7 sprite. As an example, we could replace a few of the pixels here to get a stronger look, such as a few along the eye to create a stronger eyebrow expression, swapping out the ambiguous brown pixels of the eye for something more defined, and raising the nose pixel up by 1. The result is something that I feel has a little more personality, certainly the kind we're used to seeing on Mega Man. Regardless, my main takeaway is just that these individual pixel-specific changes can have a dramatic effect on the character appearance. So once you've got the main character structure in place, it's worth spending some time to play around and iterate down in this scale just to see what a few small changes can do. So with a lot of these ideas in mind, what I'd like to do now is just hop over to a bit of time-lapse, because I thought it'd be a fun exercise to design a new Mega Man sprite of my own from scratch. I want to attempt something that's even smaller than the NES and Game Boy sprites, so I planned out a small 16x16 area, and I'll complement that with a higher color count to hopefully allow me to achieve some nice detail in the sprite. I started by placing down circles for the head and hands, and small shapes for the feet. I used a circle size of 8 pixels for the head, that way it takes up half of the overall sprite, or in other words, makes the sprite 2 heads tall, to make something really stylized and also maximize readability of the face. With the shapes in place, I started joining everything together to get some idea of the silhouette, and just see how much of it could be connected while still maintaining some sense of what it is. Then I started to slowly introduce colors for each part of the costume. And by the way, I put this palette together by starting from the colors used in the classic NES sprite, but then I extended the range to include more shade colors. And I made sure to space out the cyans and blues evenly enough that they could be used as a continuous gradient if I wanted, just to give myself the option. From here, I'm just doing a lot of that cluster work, trying to play around with the placement of singular pixels that can imply different details and costume elements, and trying to create a nice look for the face. This part's really the most fun because it's like trying to figure out this small puzzle, like you can change one thing and then it might impact the area right next to it, so you kind of have to keep doing laps and iterating down and trying to find the best combination that you can find. What I ended up with was this little guy here, and I was able to actually bump his head down another pixel, so this one's only 15 pixels tall. I played around some more because I obviously wanted to have one as well with the Mega Buster, and then I've got another one with his helmet off. For being so small, I think it's got a good amount of character and style to it, and really that also speaks to the simple but strong character design of Mega Man himself. So I hope you enjoyed joining me to look at a few of these sprite design considerations. As I mentioned, even within a small space, there are quite a few options available to us in how we design and render our character sprites, and it can be useful to sort out a few parameters before jumping into a new design. So I hope this analysis gave you a few ideas about what kind of things to look out for, and thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.